Hi, this is Richard Hooke. It's part two about Lee Harvey Oswald on November 22nd, 1963. And I just wanted to clarify a few things about his activities on that day. And these are covered in my new book that I did with Rachel White called Takedown. It's available on Amazon Books. But I just thought that it might help to clarify a little bit. If you want exact details and references, they're all in Takedown, available. You can download electronically. But anyway, I just wanted to cover on November 22nd, 1963, at about 11:45 a.m. at the TSBD, what happened is a man in a Western hat came up to the TSBD and yelled out up to use the restroom, and Danny Arce, who was planted by U.S. intelligence as a worker in the TSBD, yelled down that he would come down and open the door for him. So he let in Malcolm Wallace, who acted as if he was an old man in need of use of the restroom. And Danny Arce let him in, and Mac Wallace hid in the restroom by the domino room on the first floor. So he was in the restroom at about 11:45, Malcolm Wallace. Then Danny Arce went out on the street to have his lunch by the corner of Houston and Elm, where he was going to function as a communications point man, manning a walkie-talkie during the assassination that was supplied to him by Johnny Roselli, who was CIA and Chicago Mafia. But he met Arce there in the corner of Houston and Elm and supplied him with a CIA-issue mobile phone, and they communicated up with the sixth floor. Okay, so Arce let Wallace in at 11:45, and he headed out to the corner. Arce did, and then the sniper's nest. The sniper's nest was already built that morning. Okay, it was built by TSBD employees who helped out. They might not have even known what they were building. They were instructed to put the boxes in certain places, probably instructed by Lee Oswald. But he had help. I mean, there was a ton of boxes there, and it was already built by 11:45. It was already done. Possible employees that were on the sixth floor at the time were Danny Arce, Bill Shelley, Billy Lovelady, Jack Doherty, Charles Gibbons, Bonnie Ray Williams were all on the sixth floor at times during that morning that could have helped out building that nest. Okay. At 11:50 a.m., Lee Harvey Oswald was then seen downstairs. He was seen on the first floor, out towards the front door, and he exchanged a few words with Bill Shelley, who had an office down there as one of the managers. Out near the front door, he exchanged a few words with Bill Shelley, and then also Eddie Piper was there by the front door. It was about 11:50. And Eddie Piper said he was going to go to lunch, and Lee Oswald said, well, he thought he would too. This is on the first floor by the front door, and what Lee Oswald did is then he went up to the second floor lunchroom and purchased a Coke. So that's when he purchased a Coke. And then he went back down to the first floor domino room, which is the lunchroom where they would sit in to have lunch. And he sat down eating his bag lunch, okay, which was a cheese sandwich and an apple and the Coke that he had bought. So he had lunch down there from 12 to 12:10, Lee Oswald did. That's when he had his lunch. That's when you have lunch, is at 12 noon, not at all these other times, like they've said after the shooting or just before the shooting at 12, right after the shooting at 12:30 or something. He was already having his lunch at 12 o'clock, like any normal person would. And he was seen there having his lunch by three African-American employees of the TSBD, James Jarman, Harold Norman, and Charles Gibbons. So there isn't any doubt about it. He was in there. And what he was doing was waiting for all the employees to head out to the street to watch Jack Kennedy come by to watch the motorcade. So Lee was in there between 12 and 12:10, just waiting for everybody to head out. And they all did. They all headed out in front. So he was the only one there. And then at about 12:10 or maybe 12:11, 12:12, somewhere in there, Malcolm Wallace emerged out of the restroom. Malcolm Wallace, we believe, had an earpiece, and he was hearing updates of where the motorcade was coming up Main Street. He knew where Jack Kennedy was at all times, and so he knew, Malcolm Wallace knew at what point he and Lee Oswald should head up to the 6th floor. So even though the motorcade was late, it didn't matter to Mac Wallace because he had an earpiece, and he knew. He came out of that restroom, signaled Lee at about 12:12, and they headed upstairs. Okay, and I believe they took the elevators. If not, they took the stairs. But the elevators, when they were done getting up there, they were both locked on the 5th floor. They were locked there. They had the doors open, so they couldn't be summoned back down. The elevators, the two elevators, were both locked on the 5th floor. And Lee and Mac Wallace, they retrieved the rifles as we were hidden by the fifth floor stairwell. Okay, there were 3 rifles. There was a Mannlicher Carcano, the 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. There was a 7.65 Mauser, and then Mac Wallace had a 30-06. So there were 3 rifles. They were retrieved and taken up to the 6th floor. And then Malcolm Wallace and Lee Oswald head over to the southeast corner. Okay, that's where the sniper's nest was already built, and they began getting the rifles ready. So they were right over here in the sniper's nest, getting the rifles ready, Wallace and Oswald. And they were seen by the prisoners, Catter Corner, at the County Records Building. Wallace and Oswald were seen there getting the rifles ready. Okay, and then at approximately 12:15 to 12:22, what happened was Ruth Ann Martinez and Loy Factor arrived. They came in a brown station wagon. She parked it behind the TSPD, and they came up the back stairwell. Ruth Ann Martinez, the CIA hit lady who functioned as a communications lady that day for Malcolm Wallace, and Loy Factor, they headed up the rear stairwell and emerged on the 6th floor at about 12:20. Okay, and they saw Wallace and Oswald on the opposite corner, in the southeast corner, getting the rifles ready. And Loy Factor said that in the book, The Men on the 6th Floor. Before he died, he gave his account in there. Loy Factor said that Lee and Wallace were over there. Okay. At approximately 12:24, Mac Wallace and Ruth Ann Martinez and Loy Factor took their positions on the opposite corner from the sniper's nest. So they went over to this corner here, Wallace, Ruth Ann, and Loy Factor. That's where the windows were wide open, much more open than over at the bogus sniper's nest where nobody shot from. But Wallace, Ruth Ann, and Loy Factor were positioned behind these windows here. They stood back from the windows so their muzzle blasts would not be seen. Factor and Wallace, the rifles pointed down. They were back from the window just a little bit, and then Ruth Ann was next to them with a walkie-talkie, communicating with Danny Arce, who was down here by the corner of the Daltex building, telling them when Jack Kennedy was going to come up Houston Street, Danny Arce told Ruth Ann to tell Wallace to get ready. So that's the way that was. Now, Lee Oswald, what he did is he waited in the sniper's nest like he was going to shoot. That's what he was told to do. But he had to wait until Wallace and Factor and Martinez went to the other end of the floor. And so then he bailed. He didn't shoot. He bailed before the shooting. And he had told his mistress in New Orleans, Judith Berry Baker, over the phone that Wednesday that he was going to hang in there until it was too late to replace him with another shooter. And that's what he did. He hung in there. When Malcolm Wallace was there, he certainly couldn't leave. Wallace was a really scary guy. I mean, he was about over 200 pounds. Lee was about 150. Wallace was scary as hell. Okay, and I've talked to Rod McKenzie, who was the manager of the Holland Avenue Safe House, who was a ranger in the Korean War, and he told me he never took his eyes off of Wallace. He said Wallace scared the heck out of him. So Lee had to stay up here until Wallace went to the other end of the floor, and then at approximately somewhere around 28, Lee bailed. He put a couple of pre-fired shells down out of his pocket on the floor like he was doing his CIA job. And then he bailed back through the books and then went down on the stairs and hid the rifle by the fifth floor stairwell. Then he came all the way down to the first floor, Lee did, and he went out near the front door, which was directly below the sniper's nest, but down on the first floor. Lee came right by the front door, and he was seen just behind in the foyer at about 12:29 by Carolyn Arnold, who saw him there, saw Lee Oswald there on the first floor at 12:29. And then somewhere between 12:29 and 12:30, Lee emerged out on the first floor landing. And he was out there watching the motorcade come. The motorcade came down Main, up Houston Street. Danny Arce told Ruth Ann Martinez to get Wallace ready. The motorcade came down. The Secret Service driver, William Greer, slowly navigated the left turn onto Elm Street. Lee Oswald was down in the first floor doorway watching. He was watching Jackie Kennedy and Jack Kennedy turn the corner. On their final drive, they headed down Elm Street. Lee Oswald was watching the entire time. He was not upstairs. He didn't fire a warning shot. He was already down. He was already down in the doorway. Okay, so he didn't fire any warning shot, and there was no double up in the sniper's nest either, because they didn't anticipate that Oswald was going to bail. He'd been ordered to shoot, and he had told them that he was going to do it. So they didn't have any double ready to replace him, certainly in the final minute. So the sniper's nest was empty. It had to be empty. And Lee was down in the first floor doorway. That's where he was. And actually, okay, we've proved that he was there. We've proved it with 77 features of ID with Oswald in the doorway versus Oswald at the Dallas police station later that afternoon. So there's no question Lee was in the doorway when Jack Kennedy was shot. Okay, the car headed up Elm Street, and Ruth Ann brought her arm down, and Loy Factor shot. Loy Factor and Mac Wallace shot, and Loy Factor shot into the street because he didn't want to shoot President Kennedy. Loy Factor had been trapped into the shooting by Malcolm Wallace. He owed money, and Wallace said he'd clean the slate if he did the shooting, but he didn't tell him what the shooting was, and Factor figured out he had to shoot the president the final day as he was heading up the back of this old decrepit Civil War warehouse. It was a pretty scary ordeal for him. So he shot over the car into the street. Loy Factor's shot ricocheted down and cut James Tague on the cheek by the triple underpass. Malcolm Wallace took his first shot, and he nailed President Kennedy in the back. It went in at an angle and slammed into his spine. President Kennedy went straight up. Mac Wallace hit him at an angle coming in, and it stopped in his spine. That's what had happened there. So Jack Kennedy was still up. Oswald had bailed. He hadn't shot. They had hoped that either Oswald or Factor would have got him in the back of the head, but he wasn't shot. He was just hit in the back by Wallace. The limo was passing the sign, and at that point, Roscoe White, the badge man, shot President Kennedy in the throat. okay, from the right front of the car over the picket fence, Roscoe White. The shot nicked the sign and went into his throat. So it was either a fragment, but it didn't go all the way through. Went into his throat. That was at approximately Z202. Okay, at Z235, Zapruder framed 235. Malcolm Wallace fired a second shot into John Conley's back, went through his right back, through his right wrist into his left thigh. This was a separate shot. Wallace was able to get off those shots because he didn't have a bolt action rifle. Okay, he had a 30-06. It was not bolt action, and he did two separate shots. He had President Kennedy in the back and Wallace in the back. Okay, that was approximately 2:35. He had Conley, and then at approximately Z255 is when Ike Altkins took the famous Altkins photo from way down Elm Street, looking back up at the TSBD doorway with his telephoto lens cranked up, and he caught Lee Oswald in the doorway. And so we have the Altkins 6 photo. So we know for all time that Lee Oswald didn't do any shooting at all. We've identified him there with 77 points a match, and we've also identified Billy Lovelady as having been the guy against the opposite wall with his hands over his head. So that photo was taken at approximately Z255. So as JFK, President Kennedy, you can see him in the car getting shot. He was getting shot while Lee Oswald was watching. So Oswald was just strictly a spectator.